He laughed as the pen left his fingers and skidded across the glass table, spinning once before coming to rest near her hand. The sound echoed too loudly in the room, sharp and final, like a gavel striking wood. To him, it was the sound of freedom. To him, it was the sound of winning. He leaned back in his chair, loosened his tie, and watched her with the relaxed arrogance of a man who believed the world had already bent to his will. The city sprawled behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, all steel and light and ambition, and he felt like he owned it. He didn't notice that she hadn't reached for the pen yet. He didn't notice the way her breathing stayed steady, or how her eyes never once dropped to the documents. He only saw what he wanted to see, a woman finally accepting her place at the end of his story. "Go on," he said lightly, checking the time on his watch. "We both know this is overdue." She smiled small and polite, the kind of smile she had perfected over years of dinners where she listened more than she spoke. It was the smile of someone letting another person talk themselves into a mistake. He mistook it for resignation. He always did. Outside, traffic murmured far below, a constant reminder of motion and momentum. Inside, the air felt suspended, as if the room itself was waiting. He drummed his fingers on the armrest, already imagining the evening ahead. Drinks with investors, a quiet celebration, a clean slate. He had rehearsed this moment so many times that he no longer felt nervous, only impatient. This was supposed to be the easy part. Signatures, logistics, a brief, forgettable ending to a chapter he had already outgrown. "You don't have to look so serious," he added, chuckling. "It's not a funeral." Her gaze lifted to meet his, and for the first time that evening, he hesitated. There was something unreadable there, something calm in a way that didn't match the moment. Not anger, not sadness, control. The hesitation lasted less than a second before his confidence surged back, louder than doubt. He had always been good at ignoring things that didn't serve him. "Are you sure you've read everything?" she asked quietly. He scoffed. "My lawyers wrote it. I've read enough." She nodded, as if that settled something. She reached for the pen at last, her movements unhurried. He watched her fingers close around it and felt a flicker of triumph. This was it, the final confirmation that he was right, that he had been right all along. He stood and walked toward the window, giving her space, giving himself a view worthy of the moment. The skyline glowed in the late afternoon light, glass towers reflecting ambition back at itself. "You'll be fine," he said over his shoulder. "You always land on your feet. Just not in my world." The pen touched paper. The faint scratch of ink was barely audible, but it cut through him like a release of pressure. He smiled to himself, already detaching, already rewriting the past in a way that made him the hero. He didn't turn around. He didn't watch her sign her name with deliberate care, the way she added the final stroke and paused, just for a heartbeat, as if sealing something far larger than a marriage. "It's done," she said. He turned then, quickly, eager to see the proof. He crossed the room and snatched the papers, scanning for the signature. There it was. Clear. Legible. Final. He laughed again, a genuine, unrestrained sound, and shook his head in disbelief at how smoothly everything had gone. "Well," he said, folding the documents and sliding them into his briefcase, "that was easier than expected." She stood, smoothing the front of her jacket. Up close, he could see how simple it was, how understated. He had once loved that about her, or thought he did. Now it just looked like a lack of ambition. He felt a surge of relief that he no longer had to pretend. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. "I already have," he replied without hesitation. He moved past her toward the door, keys in hand, already mentally gone. He didn't see the way she watched him leave, not with longing, but with a quiet, measuring focus. He didn't hear the soft exhale she released once the door closed behind him, or the subtle shift in the room as the balance of power changed. The elevator ride down felt lighter than air. He checked his phone, responding to messages, setting plans in motion. Congratulations rolled in from people who had no idea what had just been signed away. By the time he stepped onto the street, the world felt wide open. He had no sense of loss, only momentum. High above, in the quiet he had abandoned, she returned to the table. She gathered the remaining copies, aligning their edges with care. Her reflection in the glass looked different now, sharper somehow, as if a mask had finally been set aside. She picked up her phone, not the one he recognized, and unlocked it with a practiced touch. "It's done," she said, her voice even. On the other end, there was no surprise, only acknowledgement. "Very well," the voice replied. "We'll proceed." She ended the call and looked out at the same skyline he had admired, seeing not a promise, but a ledger. Somewhere below, he was celebrating his freedom, unaware that the papers he had laughed over were already rippling outward, triggering clauses and consequences he had never bothered to read. She smiled then, not politely, not faintly, but with the certainty of someone who had just regained something that was always hers. The world he thought he had left behind was already rearranging itself around his absence. He had walked away believing he had closed a door. In truth, he had signed away the walls, the floor, and the ground beneath his feet, all while laughing at how easy it had been. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Sunlight crept through the sheer curtains of his penthouse bedroom, casting pale stripes across the rumpled sheets. He woke with the satisfied heaviness of a man who had slept without guilt. For a moment he lay still, letting the silence confirm what he already believed. Nothing had followed him into the night. No arguments, no regrets, no weight, just space. He rolled onto his back and laughed softly, replaying the image of her signing, the way she hadn't protested, hadn't cried, hadn't begged. He had expected at least one of those. The absence of them felt like proof of how little she had mattered in the end. He reached for his phone on the nightstand and scrolled through notifications. Messages from colleagues, a reminder about a lunch meeting, a calendar alert for a call with an investment group. Later that afternoon, life continued, efficient and predictable. He swung his legs out of bed and padded toward the bathroom, catching his reflection in the mirror, relaxed, confident, unburdened. This was what success looked like, he thought. Clean lines, forward motion. As the shower warmed, he thought briefly of her apartment across town, of her waking up alone for the first time in years. The image barely registered. If anything, it reassured him. She would manage. She always did, quietly, without demanding much. That had been her best quality, and ultimately her downfall. He stepped under the water and let it wash away the last trace of the past, unaware that the past was already recalculating his future. Across the city, she sat at a long table in a room that didn't appear on any public directory. The walls were matte white, the lighting precise, the silence purposeful. A small group of people occupied the seats around her, each with a tablet open, each waiting. No one spoke until she did. There was no need. They had been waiting for this moment far longer than he had. She slid a digital copy of the signed papers onto the central screen. The document glowed softly, the signature unmistakable. A ripple of acknowledgement moved through the room. Subtle nods exchanged glances. Not surprise, confirmation. "So it's final," one of them said. "It is," she replied. Her tone was neutral, but beneath it was a clarity that sharpened the air. All personal affiliations severed, all protections removed. Another voice, older, measured. "Then the contingencies activate immediately." She inclined her head. "Begin phase 1. Fingers moved, systems updated. Notifications dispatched to departments that would never connect the changes to a divorce signed the day before. To them, it would look like routine restructuring, overdue corrections, a shift in strategy. Only this room understood the timing. Only this room knew the cause. By the time he finished dressing, she had already reclaimed more than he would notice for days. Access permissions were revised, oversight flags quietly raised, accounts marked for review. None of it dramatic, none of it obvious. That was the point. Real power didn't announce itself. It adjusted the environment until resistance became impossible. He left his building whistling, nodding to the doorman, stepping into the waiting car that would take him to his first meeting. Traffic was heavy, but he didn't mind. He used the time to rehearse talking points, to refine the narrative he would present if anyone asked about the divorce. Amicable, necessary, mutual. He smiled at how clean it sounded. He had always been good at stories. The meeting went well. Too well, he would later think. The investors were agreeable, receptive, almost deferential. He mistook their caution for respect. He walked out energized, already planning his next move. He sent a quick message to a friend, suggesting drinks that evening. Celebration felt appropriate. At the same time, an internal report landed on a desk 3 floors above the one he occupied, flagged with a priority he had never noticed before. A discrepancy, minor but unusual. It was forwarded, then forwarded again, each time rising closer to a level he had never been invited to access. She stood alone by a window overlooking a different part of the city, listening to the muted of activity behind her. The machinery was in motion now. She didn't rush it. She knew from experience that inevitability was more effective than force. People revealed themselves when they believed they were safe. Her phone vibrated once. A single message. Phase 1 complete. She exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in readiness. This was not revenge. Revenge was loud and emotional and imprecise. This was reclamation. Correction. She had spent years minimizing herself to see who he was without the shadow of her influence. Now she would see who he was without it entirely. That evening, he raised a glass in a dim bar, laughing as his friends teased him about bachelorhood. He told the story again, embellishing details, enjoying the attention. Each retelling made it feel more real, more deserved. He didn't notice the way his phone buzzed unanswered in his pocket, or the subtle shift in tone when the bartender ran his card twice before handing it back with an apologetic smile. Probably just the network, he said easily, waving it off. From her side of the city, she watched a different set of screens, lines of data updating in real time. She noted the moment his card was flagged, the precise second his access narrowed. Not closed, not yet. Just adjusted. Enough to be felt. Enough to register as inconvenience, not threat. She allowed herself a small pause, a moment to acknowledge the symmetry of it all. He had laughed because he thought he was done. He had celebrated because he believed the story ended where he walked away. In truth, that had only been the prologue. Tomorrow, he would wake with questions he couldn't quite answer. Tomorrow, the world would feel slightly less cooperative. And she would move forward, step by measured step, not to destroy him, but to remove him, completely and permanently, from the life he had mistaken for his own. By midweek, the unease had settled into his routine like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. Nothing was overtly wrong, which somehow made it worse. Meetings were postponed without explanation. Emails went unanswered longer than usual. A proposal he had sent up the chain came back with comments that felt oddly distant, as if written by someone unfamiliar with his work. He told himself it was coincidence, that organizations ebbed and flowed, that friction was the price of progress. Still, the sensation followed him, faint but persistent, like a shadow just outside his peripheral vision. He compensated the only way he knew how. He talked more, asserted himself in rooms where he'd once been casual, reminded people, subtly at first, then more directly, of his track record, his numbers, his value. He laughed louder, leaned back in his chair, filled silences before anyone else could. Confidence had always worked for him. Confidence had always been enough. Across the city, she reviewed a dossier bearing his name. It wasn't new. She had read every page years ago, memorized patterns, tendencies, the way he reacted under pressure. What interested her now were the updates. Small things, behavioral shifts, increased communication frequency, a spike in calendar requests, the quiet tells of a man sensing instability without understanding its source. "Let it breathe," she said to the person beside her. "He'll accelerate on his own." The person nodded. They all did. In this room, her words were not suggestion. On Thursday afternoon, he finally noticed something concrete. His access to a shared drive returned an error message, brief, generic. He frowned and tried again, same result. He leaned out of his office and flagged down an assistant, asking if there was maintenance scheduled. She checked, shook her head, promised to look into it. He thanked her, smiling, but the knot in his chest tightened. He sent a message to IT. No immediate response. At lunch, he picked at his food, distracted. He told himself he was imagining patterns that weren't there. He had just finalized a divorce. Of course things felt off. Anyone would feel off. He finished his meal and paid, relieved when the transaction went through without issue. See? Nothing, just noise. That night, she attended a private event under a name few people recognized. The room was filled with people who moved markets with a handshake, who spoke in half sentences and understood entire strategies. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing context, confirming assumptions. When someone mentioned a pending shift in leadership at his firm, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering it for the first time. "Necessary," she said simply. No one questioned her assessment. Friday morning, he arrived early, determined to get ahead of the day. He sat at his desk, coffee cooling untouched, refreshing his inbox. When the notification finally came from IT, his relief was immediate, followed by confusion. Access restricted pending review. Review of what? He reread the message, searching for implication. There was none. Just procedure. He replied, polite but firm, asking for clarification. Minutes passed, then more. He stood ND paced, glancing at the glass walls of nearby offices, wondering who knew something he didn't. At the same time, she signed off on a sequence of actions that would never be traced back to her personally. Oversight requests, compliance checks, routine, on paper, devastating in effect. She had learned long ago that systems protected themselves first. All she had to do was give them a reason. By the end of the day, he was exhausted. The effort of maintaining certainty had drained him more than any actual crisis ever had. He went home early, telling himself rest would reset his perspective. In the quiet of his apartment, he poured a drink and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. For the first time, he thought of her without dismissal. Not with longing, with calculation. Who was she now? What was she doing? The thought irritated him. It shouldn't matter. It didn't matter. He finished his drink and went to bed, sleep coming in restless fragments. She slept soundly. Over the weekend, the distance widened. He sent messages that went unanswered, invitations declined without explanation. On Sunday night, he reviewed his finances out of habit and paused at an unfamiliar notation. A hold. Temporary, according to the description. His jaw tightened. Temporary or not, it was new. He told himself he would sort it out Monday. Monday arrived with a summons. The meeting request was brief, mandatory, and scheduled above his usual level of involvement. He read it twice, then a third time, pulse quickening. This was it, he thought. The moment things clarified. The moment his importance reasserted itself. He straightened his tie in the mirror longer than usual, practiced his L expression, his controlled smile. In another building entirely, she prepared for a different kind of meeting, one that would not involve raised voices or dramatic reveals, one that would end exactly as she intended. She reviewed the agenda, precise and unforgiving, each item connected, each consequence justified. When he entered the room later that morning, he felt the shift immediately. Conversations stopped, eyes lifted, then slid away. He took his seat, spine straight, chin high. He was ready to defend himself against accusations he still didn't fully understand. She entered last, not announced, not dramatic, just present. Their eyes met across the table. For a fraction of a second, recognition flared, sharp and destabilizing. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his mind scrambling to reframe the moment. She looked the same, he told himself, calm, composed, unremarkable. But something in the room had aligned around her, subtly, unmistakably. As the meeting began, he felt it then, the unmistakable sensation of gravity shifting, of the world reordering itself with him no longer at the center. He didn't yet know how far he would fall, only that the ground beneath him had already begun to give way. The chair opposite him scraped softly as someone adjusted their position, the sound magnified in the silence that followed her arrival. He noticed details he normally ignored, the way people sat straighter, the way tablets were angled toward her without conscious thought, the way no one checked their phone. The meeting opened with procedural language, but the cadence was different, tighter, as if every word had been weighed in advance. He tried to follow, but his attention kept drifting back to her. She hadn't acknowledged him. Not a glance, not a nod. It was as if he were furniture. He waited for his cue, for the moment when someone would turn to him and ask for context or clarification. It didn't come. Slides advanced, metrics appeared, his name surfaced in passing, attached to a line item, then moved past without comment. He felt heat creep up his neck. This wasn't how meetings went. This wasn't how things worked. He leaned forward, about to speak, then hesitated. Something in the room told him it would be a mistake. She listened with her hands folded loosely on the table, eyes focused, expression unreadable. When she spoke, it was to ask a question that redirected the discussion, subtle but decisive. People responded quickly, eagerly, as if relieved to be guided. He watched this exchange with a growing sense of disorientation. He had spent years believing leadership looked like volume and certainty. What he saw now was quieter, more efficient, and infinitely more dangerous. As the meeting progressed, the agenda turned to oversight, compliance, risk exposure, words that rarely applied to him directly. He straightened, preparing to relax, only to feel his stomach drop as his department came into focus. A report appeared, dense with figures. He recognized some of them. Others were unfamiliar. He scanned for errors, for misinterpretations he could correct. She spoke his name then. It was neutral, almost gentle, but it landed with the weight of a verdict. Every eye in the room turned toward him. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Yes," he said. "I can explain." "There's no need," she replied, not looking at him. The utter is clear. The phrase echoed in his mind. Clear. He opened his mouth again, more insistently this time, but the conversation moved on, leaving him behind. He sat there, pulse pounding, trying to understand how explanation had become irrelevant. When the meeting ended, people stood immediately, gathering their things. No one lingered. No one approached him. He remained seated for a moment, stunned, then rose abruptly, chair legs scraping louder than he intended. He caught her attention then, just barely. "We need to talk," he said. She regarded him calmly, as if assessing whether the request warranted a response. After a moment, she nodded once. "Very well," she said, briefly. They stepped into a side room, glass walls providing privacy without isolation. He closed the door a little too forcefully, then turned to face her, frustration spilling over. "What is this?" he demanded. "Why am I being blindsided?" "You're not," she said. "You're being observed." "That's not an answer." "It is," she replied evenly. "Just not one you like." He laughed sharply. "You can't seriously be part of this. You don't even work here." She tilted her head. "That's an assumption you've always relied on." The words struck him harder than he expected. For the first time, uncertainty edged into his anger. He searched her face for some sign of the woman he thought he knew, the one who deferred, who smoothed edges. He found none. "What do you want?" he asked. "I already have it," she said. The conversation ended there. She opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, immediately reabsorbed into the flow of people who treated her presence as natural, expected. He stood alone. Eve for a moment longer, then followed, his mind racing. By the end of the day, the implications had begun to surface. A scheduled presentation was reassigned. A decision he would normally sign off on came back with additional oversight. Each instance small, defensible, cumulative. He felt himself being edged out, not expelled, but diminished. That night he went home and poured another drink, hands unsteady. He replayed the meeting again and again, searching for the moment he could have changed the outcome. There wasn't one. That realization scared him more than any confrontation could have. She spent the evening reviewing progress reports, ticking off completed items with methodical satisfaction. Nothing had deviated, nothing needed correction. The system was doing what systems did best when properly aligned. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the window, watching the city settle into night. Somewhere out there, he was beginning to understand that laughter, the easy kind, had a cost. That signatures mattered, that the world he thought he'd divorced was far larger and far less forgiving than he had imagined. The following days blurred into a pattern of restrained panic. He showed up early, stayed late, and spoke carefully, as if the wrong inflection might trigger something unseen. His confidence, once effortless, had become a performance that required concentration. He noticed how often people deferred decisions upward now, how rarely they looked to him for approval. When they did, it felt procedural, not trusting. He told himself it was temporary. Organizations corrected course all the time. This was just another cycle. Still, the sense of being evaluated with OUT criteria gnawed at him. On Wednesday afternoon, an email arrived requesting a formal review of his last 3 quarters. The phrasing was polite, the implication was not. He read it twice, then forwarded it to his assistant with instructions to pull supporting materials. As he did, a realization crept in that made his throat tighten. He didn't actually know who had requested the review. There was no name, no title, only a department code that routed higher than anything he'd ever interacted with. He considered calling her. The thought startled him. He hadn't intended to reach out, hadn't planned it. But suddenly she felt like the only fixed point in a landscape that was shifting beneath him. He dismissed the idea immediately, annoyed with himself. She had nothing to do with this. She couldn't. And yet, the memory of her calm in that meeting refused to leave him. Across town, she approved the next layer of action with the same measured precision. The review request had been expected. It was a natural response from a system detecting inconsistency. She didn't interfere. Interference created fingerprints. Instead, she observed. She wanted to see how he handled scrutiny when he couldn't charm his way out of it. He handled it poorly. The review meeting was smaller, quieter and far more uncomfortable. Questions came quickly, without preamble. Why projections had been adjusted, why approvals had been expedited, why certain decisions lacked documentation. He answered as best he could, irritation creeping into his voice despite his efforts to remain composed. He cited experience, intuition, results. The panel listened without reacting, notes taken, expressions neutral. And it was over. No conclusions were offered, no reassurance given. He left the room feeling hollowed out. That evening his card declined again. This time there was no polite apology, only an automated message directing him to contact his provider. He stood at the counter, heat flooding his face, and forced a laugh that fooled no one. He paid another way and left quickly, heart hammering. At home he checked his accounts more carefully. The holds were still there, more now. Temporary, each labeled, each justified. Together they formed a net. He sat down hard on the couch, the weight of it finally pressing through denial. This wasn't coincidence, this wasn't bad luck, this was deliberate. Her name surfaced in his thoughts again, unbidden. The way she had looked at him in that side room, the way she'd said she already had what she wanted. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then set it down. Pride warred with fear, and for once, fear had the edge. She spent the night in a different city, attending a closed-door session that would never make headlines. The topic was long-term positioning, market consolidation, risk management. She spoke only when necessary, but when she did, the room listened. Her perspective carried weight, not because she demanded it, but because it consistently proved accurate. When someone mentioned his firm, she allowed herself a brief pause, just enough to seem thoughtful. "There are vulnerabilities," she said. "They'll need addressing." The statement was accepted without question. By Friday, the review results were circulating internally. He wasn't copied, but he heard about them through strained conversations and careful omissions. Concern. Recommendations. Oversight. The language was clinical, but the message was unmistakable. His autonomy was shrinking. He stayed late that night, alone in his office, staring out at the city that no longer felt like it belonged to him. He thought about the moment he'd laughed, about how certain he'd been that the papers meant an ending. He wondered for the first time what else they might have meant. She returned home as the week closed, satisfied but not triumphant. This wasn't about victory, it was about balance, about correcting an equation that had been skewed by assumption and ego. She reviewed the week's outcomes, noting where momentum had increased, where resistance remained. He was still clinging to the idea that he could recover, that if he just pushed harder, spoke louder, asserted himself more forcefully, things would revert. She knew better. The harder he pushed, the more visible his flaws became. The system didn't need her to intervene anymore. It was doing the work for her. On Sunday night, he sat alone at his kitchen table, a half-empty glass in front of him, papers spread out in disarray. He tried to map a way forward, to identify allies, to regain leverage. Each path led to the same obstacle, diminished trust. He had built his success on perception, and perception was eroding. Somewhere beyond his awareness, another meeting was being scheduled, another decision queued, another adjustment made. The process was quiet, relentless, and entirely indifferent to his protests. He had laughed when he signed, believing the world would stay the same without her. Now, as the walls closed in incrementally, he began to understand the truth he had missed. He had divorced a woman. He had divorced the architecture that held him up. And architecture, once removed, didn't announce its absence. It simply let gravity do the rest. By the start of the next week, the change was no longer subtle. It announced itself in the way conversations stopped when he approached, in the careful neutrality people used when they spoke to him, in the absence of invitations that once arrived without asking. He had not been fired. He had not been reprimanded. He had simply been reclassified. The realization settled heavily in his chest, harder to fight because there was no single thing to push against. He requested a one-on-one with his direct superior, framing it as a routine alignment check. The response came hours later, polite and non-committal, suggesting a group sync later in the month instead. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, feeling something close to disbelief. That had never happened before. He had always been accessible, essential. Now he was deferred. He started documenting everything. Emails, approvals, decisions. He told himself it was preparation, but the act itself felt defensive, like gathering evidence for a trial that hadn't yet been announced. His confidence narrowed into vigilance. He slept poorly, waking with his jaw clenched, his thoughts looping through conversations that hadn't happened yet. She watched the pattern emerge with clinical interest. The metrics reflected exactly what she expected. Increased internal messaging, decreased influence, rising stress indicators. He was adapting but not evolving. There was a difference. Adaptation was reaction. Evolution required insight, and insight required humility. He had never been good at that. Midweek, the call finally came. It wasn't dramatic, no raised voices, no accusations, just a request to attend a strategy session involving senior leadership and external advisors. His name was one of several listed, but its placement at the bottom did not go unnoticed. He accepted immediately, relief and dread tangling in his gut. This was his chance, he told himself, his opportunity to reassert relevance. The room was larger than necessary, designed to intimidate through scale. He took a seat near the end of the table, noting who sat where, cataloguing alliances. When she entered, conversation dipped, then resumed at a lower volume. He watched her take her place without ceremony, a presence so natural it was almost invisible. That frightened him more than any overt display of authority could have. The session moved quickly. Market positioning, risk exposure, long-term projections. He followed along, contributing when he could, choosing his words carefully. Each time he spoke, he felt the room assess him, not with hostility, but with evaluation. He wasn't being challenged. He was being measured. At one point, she spoke directly to a concern he had raised, refining it, expanding it, resolving it with a precision that left nothing to argue. He felt a flicker of admiration before resentment smothered it. He hadn't realized, until that moment, how much he relied on being the smartest person in the room. When the session ended, she gathered her things and stood. He hesitated, then followed her into the corridor. "Wait," he said. She turned, expression neutral. "I need to understand what's happening," he said, "because it feels like I'm being pushed out." She considered him for a moment, really looked at him, as if deciding how much truth he could withstand. "You're not being pushed," she said. "You're being revealed. That doesn't make sense." "It will," she replied. "Eventually." He swallowed. "Is this because of us?" She shook her head. This was always bigger than us. The answer offered no comfort. She walked away, leaving him with the echo of her words and the growing certainty that he was no longer in control of the narrative. By Friday, the decision arrived. It came in the form of a formal notice, delivered with impeccable politeness, a role realignment, a strategic shift. His responsibilities would be redistributed, his title adjusted, his compensation reviewed at a later date. It was all framed as optimization, as progress. There was no mention of failure, no acknowledgement of loss. He read it 3 times, hands trembling. That evening he packed his office in silence. No one stopped by. No one asked questions. He carried his box to the elevator alone, the weight of it unfamiliar. When the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the mirrored wall. He barely recognized the man staring back. She received confirmation of the change an hour later. She noted it, then set the file aside. There was no satisfaction in it, only completion. One more imbalance corrected, one more loose end secured. As she left her office that night, the city stretched out before her, vast and intricate, a network of cause and effect she had learned to navigate long before she met him. Somewhere within it, he was recalibrating his understanding of power, of consequence, of what it meant to laugh at a moment that deserved respect. He had thought the papers marked an ending. In truth, they marked his removal from a system he never knew existed. And as that system continued on without him, indifferent and precise, he began to grasp the most painful truth of all. The world had not noticed his departure. The first week after the notice passed in a haze, he woke at the same time out of habit, dressed in clothes that no longer matched a role, and sat at his kitchen table staring at a phone that no longer dictated his schedule. The silence was oppressive. It pressed in on him, filling the space where urgency used to live. He told himself this was temporary, a recalibration, a momentary pause before the next ascent. He had always landed on his feet before. There was no reason to believe this time would be different. He reached out to contacts he hadn't spoken to in months, old colleagues, former mentors, people who owed him favors, or at least smiles. The responses came slowly, if at all. Some were polite deferrals. Others were vague acknowledgments that never turned into meetings. A few never replied. Each unanswered message chipped away at the narrative he had built for himself, the one where influence lingered long after a title disappeared. On Wednesday, he secured a lunch with a former associate at a discreet restaurant downtown. He arrived early, choosing a table with a view, rehearsing the conversation in his head. When the associate finally arrived, the greeting was cordial but stiff. They spoke about market conditions, about uncertainty, about opportunity in abstract terms. When he steered the conversation toward collaboration, the associate hesitated, fingers tightening around his glass. "I need to be careful," the man said finally. "Things are sensitive right now." "Sensitive how?" he pressed. The associate glanced around, lowering his voice. "Your name has come up, not positively." The words landed like a slap. He laughed reflexively, dismissively, but the sound rang hollow even to his own ears. "That's absurd." "I'm just telling you what I'm hearing," the associate replied. "It's not personal, it's risk." They parted soon after, the bill paid quickly, the conversation unfinished. He stepped out onto the street feeling exposed, as if something invisible had been stripped away. For the first time, the possibility that this wasn't a dip but a descent forced its way into his thoughts. That evening he drove aimlessly, passing familiar landmarks that now felt distant, offices where he'd once walked in unannounced, bars where he'd been greeted by name. He realized with a jolt that his access to these spaces had always been borrowed, contingent, tied to something he no longer possessed. Across the city, she reviewed reports from a different vantage point. Her days were full, structured, layered with decisions that would echo far beyond the present moment. His name appeared occasionally, less frequently now, usually as a footnote to a resolved issue. She felt no urge to follow his unraveling closely. What mattered was that the system remained stable, that momentum continued uninterrupted. On Friday, he received an official invitation to exit the building he had once entered with authority. A date, a time, instructions. The formality stung more than any outright dismissal could have. He complied without protest, packing the last of his belongings under the watchful neutrality of security. No one spoke as he left. The doors closed behind him with a soft final sound. At home, surrounded by boxes, he sat on the floor and let the weight of it settle. He thought about calling her again, about demanding answers, about accusing her of orchestrating his fall. The impulse flared. The N faded. Even now he wasn't certain. Certainty had abandoned him. She spent that same evening at a private dinner, seated among people who discussed futures as if they were contracts waiting to be signed. When the conversation turned to leadership, to the cost of complacency, she listened, then offered a measured observation. People mistake proximity to power for ownership of it, she said. They forget that access can be revoked. The comment was met with nods, with quiet appreciation. It required no elaboration. Weeks passed. His savings thinned faster than he anticipated. Lifestyle had a momentum of its own, one he struggled to arrest. He sold things quietly, one by one, justifying each decision as temporary. He told himself he was streamlining, not losing. Still, the numbers told a different story. One afternoon he passed a newsstand and froze. Her face looked back at him from the cover of a business magazine, composed and unyielding. The headline spoke of vision, of transformation, of decisive leadership in uncertain times. He stood there longer than he meant to, the world moving around him as if he were anchored in place. He remembered the way she had signed, the calm precision of it. He remembered laughing. The realization arrived slowly, painfully. She hadn't taken anything from him. She had simply stopped giving. Everything he had built rested on an assumption he had never questioned, an assumption that power was something he generated rather than something he was allowed to wield. By the time he turned away from the magazine, something in him had shifted, not resolve, not hope, recognition. Too late to change the outcome, but sharp enough to hurt. He read the same article that night, not on paper, but on a screen, skimming past the praise to the data beneath it. The narrative would continue, as narratives always did, shaping perception, reinforcing reality. She closed the file and moved on to the next decision waiting for her attention. The distance between them was now absolute, measured not in miles but in relevance. He had stepped out of a world that required constant renewal, and it had sealed itself behind him without malice or memory. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the echo of his own laughter replaying with merciless clarity. For the first time, he understood that the moment he had treated as an ending had been a beginning of a very different kind, one where the rules no longer bent to his confidence and the world no longer cared whether he believed in his own importance or not. Winter arrived quietly, without the dramatic snowfall he remembered from years past. It settled into the city in grey layers, damp and persistent, mirroring the dull weight that had taken residence in his chest. Days blurred together. Applications sent. Follow-ups ignored. Interviews that ended with polite smiles and promises that never materialized. He learned to recognize the moment it shifted, when interest cooled, when a name was typed into a database and something unseen changed the tone of the room. At first he argued, he explained, he reframed. He blamed timing, markets, bad luck. Eventually, he stopped doing even that. The pattern was undeniable. Whatever reputation he had once carried had been replaced by something far heavier, something that followed him invisibly from room to room. He wasn't an employer. Exactly. He was untouchable, a risk no one wanted to inherit. One afternoon, desperation pushed him to reach out to someone he had once dismissed as insignificant. A junior analyst he'd mentored briefly, then forgotten. The reply came quickly, almost eagerly, and for a moment hope flared. They met in a coffee shop near the river, steam fogging the windows as commuters rushed past outside. The analyst listened intently, nodding, sympathetic. "I wish I could help," the analyst said finally, "but my director was very clear." "Clear about what?" he asked, already knowing. "That your situation isn't recoverable," the analyst said softly. "At least not right now." The words lingered long after they parted. Recoverable, as if he were damage assessed by an insurance company, as if time alone could repair what had been removed. That evening, he downsized again, sold the car, moved into a smaller place on the edge of the city, somewhere anonymity came easily. The walls were thin, the neighbors loud. It felt temporary, he told himself. Everything did, yet each concession made the next easier, until loss became routine. She watched winter from a window high above the city, the snow tracing familiar patterns along streets she knew by heart. Her days were dense with responsibility, her nights quieter than before. Not lonely, intentional. She traveled often now, moving between capitals and boardrooms, her presence expected, her absence noted. Occasionally someone mentioned him. Not directly, as an example, a cautionary note. She never corrected the narrative. Narratives, she knew, were useful precisely because they simplified. The truth was more complex, but complexity rely changed outcomes. As the year turned, she authorized a series of expansions that would redefine the company's footprint. The work absorbed her completely. Momentum built, markets responded. The distance between who she had been and who she was now widened into something unbridgeable. He marked the new year alone, the city's fireworks distant and muffled. He didn't toast. He didn't make resolutions. He simply watched, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, aware that time no longer felt like something he could outrun. In early spring, he found work. Not the kind he'd envisioned, not the kind that came with offices and assistants and titles. Contract-based, temporary, a fraction of what he once earned, he accepted without negotiation. Pride had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The work was monotonous but grounding. It filled hours. It demanded attention without asking for belief. He told himself it was a step. Forward or sideways, he wasn't sure. At night, exhaustion replaced anxiety, and sleep came easier. One evening, on his way home, he passed a television mounted in a bar window. A familiar face caught his eye. He stopped, heart thudding, and watched as she spoke to a room full of reporters, her posture relaxed, her answers precise. The caption beneath her name listed achievements that spanned continents. She smiled once, briefly, and the crowd leaned in. He stood there until the segment ended, the reflection of his own face faint against the glass. He didn't feel anger, not anymore. What he felt was distance, vast and impersonal, like standing on a shore watching a ship disappear beyond the horizon. She flew that night, the city shrinking beneath her, as the plane climbed. She reviewed notes, responded to messages, approved decisions. Somewhere between one agenda item and the next, a memory surfaced uninvited. A glass table, a spinning pen, laughter. She acknowledged it, then set it aside. Memory, like sentiment, had its place. It just wasn't here. By late spring, he had learned a new rhythm, smaller, quieter. He stopped checking certain accounts, stopped scanning headlines for her name, though it still appeared. He stopped telling the story of what had happened because he no longer knew how to frame it in a way that made sense. What remained was a stripped-down version of himself, one forced to confront the truth beneath the ambition. He had mistaken leverage for ownership, proximity for permanence. The lesson had been expensive, comprehensive, irreversible. On a warm evening in June, he sat on the steps outside his building, watching the light fade. For the first time in months, the ache in his chest dulled, not healed, just quieter. Acceptance, he realized, wasn't forgiveness. It was resignation to reality. Somewhere far away, she concluded a negotiation that would reshape an industry. Applause filled the room. She acknowledged it with a nod, already thinking ahead. The world moved forward, carried by forces larger than individual stories. He laughed once then, softly, at the irony of it all. The sound surprised him. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't mocking. It was recognition, finally complete. He had laughed when he signed because he thought he was losing nothing. Now he understood what it meant to misread a moment. The summer heat pressed down on the city with a dull insistence, turning sidewalks into mirrors, and tempers brittle. He adapted to it the way he had adapted to everything else lately, without protest, without expectation. Work filled his days in a way that was both numbing and stabilizing. He showed up, completed tasks, collected modest paychecks, and went home. No one asked about his past. No one cared enough to inquire. There was relief in that anonymity, even as it stung. He learned the geography of his new life slowly, which grocery store marked down produce at the end of the day, which bus routes ran late, which cafes didn't mind if he sat for hours with a single coffee and a laptop that now felt more like a tool than a symbol. The scale of things had changed. Where he once thought in quarters and forecasts, he now thought in weeks, sometimes days. The adjustment was humbling, but it was also real. For the first time in years, nothing in his life was theoretical. Every so often, something would jolt him back. A headline glimpsed in passing, a familiar name overheard in conversation, a building he used to enter without thinking. Each time the reaction grew weaker, the ache dulled, the memory lost its edge. He realized with a mix of sadness and relief that even the most consuming falls eventually became background noise. She experienced summer differently. Travel blurred seasons together, rendering weather a detail rather than a condition. Meetings took place in climates controlled by design, in rooms where the temperature never distracted from the agenda. Her days were full, but not frantic. There was a rhythm to decision-making now, a confidence that came from alignment rather than force. She had stopped proving herself. Results did that for her. At a company. Neference in late July. She spoke about sustainability, about resilience built into systems rather than imposed on individuals. The audience listened intently, taking notes, nodding at familiar truths framed with uncommon clarity. When questions came, they were thoughtful, respectful. She answered without embellishment, without performance. Authority no longer required volume. Back home, he spent an afternoon sorting through old files on a hard drive he hadn't opened in months. Presentations, emails, plans that had once felt urgent. He deleted most of them without hesitation. They belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. The act felt strangely cleansing, like clearing out a room long abandoned. One file gave him pause, a scanned copy of the papers, the signature clear, unmistakable. He stared at it longer than he intended, tracing the line of ink with his eyes. He remembered the laughter again, not with shame this time, but with curiosity. What had he been feeling in that moment? Relief, superiority, certainty, the absence of doubt. He closed the file and shut down the computer. Some questions he understood now were answered not by revisiting the past, but by living through its consequences. In August, an unexpected message arrived, a short email from someone he didn't recognize at first, a former colleague of hers, though he didn't know that yet. The message was polite, professional, offering a small consulting opportunity related to a project tangential to his previous expertise. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't lucrative, but it was work that acknowledged his skills without resurrecting his old identity. He accepted. The project demanded focus and accountability. He delivered what was asked, on time, without trying to impress. When feedback came, it was direct and constructive. No subtext, no games. He realized how exhausting the old dance had been, how much energy he had spent reading rooms instead of solving problems. She was aware of the project, distantly. It crossed her desk as one of many initiatives underway, notable only because it functioned efficiently. She approved its continuation without comment, unaware of the name attached to a single line item, or perhaps aware and unconcerned. At this stage, the distinction didn't matter. As summer waned, he found himself thinking less about what he had lost and more about what remained. Capacity, adaptability, the ability to rebuild even if the structure looked nothing like before. It wasn't redemption, it was continuity. One evening, walking home as the light softened into gold, he passed a group of people laughing outside a restaurant. The sound rose and fell, unremarkable, unburdened. He felt a surprising lightness in his chest. Not joy, not sorrow, presence. She stood on a balcony overlooking another city, watching the same color settle over unfamiliar streets. A call ended. Another decision made. The work continued as it always would. She leaned on the railing for a moment, breathing in the air, grounded in the knowledge that the life she led now was not a reaction but a choice, long deferred and finally claimed. The world had not punished him out of malice, he understood now. It had simply withdrawn its support when the terms changed. She had not orchestrated his downfall with cruelty. She had stepped back, and gravity had done the rest. As autumn approached, he felt something close to steadiness take hold. The story he had once told about himself had ended, but another had begun, quieter and less forgiving of illusion. It required no laughter to sustain it, only attention. Somewhere far above the noise of daily life, systems continued to shift, markets adjusted, power moved where it always moved. He was no longer inside those currents, but he could feel their wake, and that was enough. The papers had been signed. The world had been divorced. And in the space left behind, two lives continued, not as mirror images or opposing forces, but as separate trajectories that would never intersect again, each shaped by the same moment, interpreted in radically different ways. Autumn arrived with a sharpness that felt almost deliberate. The air cooled, leaves turned, and the city adopted a sense of forward motion that no longer included him in its urgency. He welcomed it. There was clarity in seasons changing, in the certainty that things moved whether one kept pace or not. He had stopped trying to outrun that truth. The consulting work extended into another small contract, then another. Nothing large enough to feel like a comeback, but enough to string days together with purpose. He learned to measure success differently now, not in recognition or leverage, but in completion, in reliability, in the quiet satisfaction of doing something well without expecting it to echo. Occasionally someone would ask about his past, a casual question usually framed as curiosity rather than challenge. He answered simply, without embellishment. He no longer needed to defend the version of himself that had collapsed. That version had been built on momentum alone, and momentum, he had learned, was a fragile foundation. She marked the season with a different kind of awareness. Autumn was when long-term strategies solidified, when projections narrowed into commitments. Her calendar filled with decisive meetings, the kind that shaped years rather than quarters. She moved through them with the assurance of someone who understood not just the numbers, but the consequences behind them. In a rare quiet moment, she revisited the city where it had all shifted. The apartment was gone now, replaced by a clean, neutral space that belonged to no one in particular. She walked through it slowly, noting how little of the past remained. The glass table was gone, the chairs different, the echoes softer. She felt no nostalgia, only closure. He spent that same weekend packing up the last remnants of his former life, suits he no longer wore, accessories that felt theatrical now. He donated most of it, keeping only what was practical. The process felt symbolic, but not ceremonial, just necessary. As November settled in, a familiar name surfaced in conversation again, this time without context. Someone mentioned her in passing, not with awe or resentment, but with respect. Her accomplishments had become normal, expected. The world adjusted quickly to new constants. He listened without reacting, surprised by the absence of pain. One night, walking home under bare trees, he laughed quietly to himself. Not at the past, not at her, but at the simplicity of it all. How easily he had confused proximity with possession. How confidently he had mistaken permission for power. The lesson had been merciless, but it had been thorough. He stood in another room, another city, signing documents with the same steady hand she had used that day. The motion was familiar, unremarkable. She didn't think about him as she signed. There was no need. That chapter had resolved itself long ago. By the time winter returned, the story had settled into its final shape. He was no longer falling. She was no longer proving. The distance between them was no longer charged with meaning. It simply existed. He sat at a small desk one evening, reviewing notes for the next day's work, and felt something like quiet pride. Not the loud kind that demanded witnesses, but the internal kind that came from survival, from adaptation, from understanding too late but fully. She closed her laptop after a long day and allowed herself a rare pause. The world outside moved steadily, predictably. She had chosen this life not out of spite, but out of clarity. She had learned, as he had, that moments misread could shape everything that followed. The laughter that had once echoed in that room no longer mattered. What mattered was what it had revealed. The first snow fell overnight, light and unremarkable, coating the streets in a thin layer that softened edges without erasing them. He woke early, as he often did now, and watched it through the narrow window of his apartment. The city looked quieter this way, as if it had paused to breathe. He wrapped his hands around a mug of coffee and felt the warmth seep in slowly. There was no rush, no urgency waiting on the other side of the door. The absence of pressure still surprised him, even after all this time. He left for work bundled against the cold, joining the steady flow of people moving with purpose he no longer envied. At his desk, he reviewed tasks, answered messages, completed what was asked. It was simple work, honest work. When he finished, he shut down his computer and went home without lingering, without searching for validation. The day ended cleanly. That night he dreamed of nothing in particular. She stood at a window in another city, watching snow gather on rooftops she could not name. The meeting behind her had concluded successfully as expected. Applause had come and gone. Contracts were signed. The future aligned itself into something manageable. She felt tired, but it was the good kind, the kind that followed intention rather than resistance. As the year drew to a close, both lives settled fully into their separate trajectories. No more echoes, no more unanswered questions. The story that had once bound them together had reached its quiet conclusion, not with a dramatic reckoning, but with understanding. He no longer wondered what might have happened if he had paused, if he had read more closely, if he had looked up instead of laughing. Those questions belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. The man he was now accepted consequence without embellishment. The lesson had been learned, and learning, he discovered, did not require perpetual regret. She moved forward with the certainty of someone who had reclaimed authorship over her own life. The world responded accordingly. Power recognized clarity. Systems rewarded consistency. What she built now was not a reaction to loss, but a continuation of something long delayed. On the last evening of the year, he walked through the city as fireworks began to crackle in the distance. He stopped on a bridge and watched reflections ripple across the dark water. Somewhere, people were laughing, celebrating endings and beginnings with equal enthusiasm. He smiled faintly, not because he felt triumphant, but because he felt present. He thought briefly of the sound of that pen skidding across glass, of the confidence that had filled him in that moment, of how absolute he had felt. The memory no longer hurt. It simply existed, a marker on a long road. She raised a glass in a quiet room with people who knew her not as a symbol, but as a decision-maker, a force, a constant. The toast was understated, the sentiment clear. There was no mention of the past. Midnight passed. The world continued. He returned home and sat by the window, listening to the city settle. Tomorrow would be another ordinary day, and that was enough. He had learned, too late but completely, that the most dangerous moments were the ones that felt easiest, the ones that invited laughter when attention was required. She closed the door on another year, already thinking ahead. The signature she placed on the final document of the night was firm, practiced, unremarkable. Just ink on paper, just another choice made with full awareness. Somewhere between those two moments, the truth of it all became clear. Power did not announce itself. Loss did not demand permission. And the world did not pause for anyone who mistook confidence for comprehension. He had laughed when he signed because he believed nothing was at stake. Now, standing in the quiet aftermath of that belief, he understood the simplest, hardest lesson of all. You never know what you are divorcing until it is gone.